He owned everything as far as the eye could see, but he pulled on his most worn-out threads and went to toil on his own land, like a complete stranger. He wanted to find out one simple thing: if there was a woman in that world capable of loving a man who had nothing to offer, and fate placed him side by side with the only person everyone there despised. A young woman who carried the weight of an unjust accusation on her shoulders, and who, even so, was the only one to extend a hand when he needed it most. Before we go on, I want to ask you a simple favor. If you haven't already subscribed to the Bush Tales channel, now's your chance. Go ahead and subscribe. Also, hit that like button to support our work, and tell me in the comments what part of Australia you're listening to this story from. I'm always chuffed to know you're out there, living every emotion right along with me. Now, let's dive into this tale. In the late 19th century, in isolated parts of Australia, stories like this were common. Angus Norton was 33 years old and owned Aroera Downs Station, a property that stretched for thousands of acres of fertile land in the Australian bush. He'd inherited those lands from his father when he was still young, barely old enough to manage his own life, and with hard yakka and stubbornness, he'd turned the station into one of the most prosperous in the region. He bred prime cattle, grew coffee, and maintained a market garden that supplied neighboring townships. The homestead sat high up, hidden amongst ancient gum trees, nearly 2 kilometers from the workers' quarters. That's why most of the station hands had never crossed paths with the true owner of those lands. They knew only his name, spoken with respect and a certain fear, but his face was a mystery to those living the daily grind of the bush. The one giving orders day to day was Desmond, the overseer, a man of 50, with a broad build, a gruff voice, and harsh manners that made the workers drop their heads just hearing his boots on the gravel. Desmond ran everything with an iron fist and a notebook in hand, jotting down absences, dishing out punishments, and controlling what went in and out of the station's store sheds. He was the one who hired and fired the hands, and for years, no one dared to question his decisions. Angus trusted him out of habit, a legacy of loyalty that stretched back to his father's time. But in recent months, something had been bothering the station owner. The books weren't adding up, supplies were going missing, and the reports reaching the homestead about the treatment of the workers were growing darker and darker. But it wasn't just the station keeping Angus awake at night. His older brother, Gareth, had been relentlessly pressuring him to accept a marriage to Charlotte, daughter of Edward Ned Thompson, the owner of neighboring lands, and a political influence that greatly interested the family's business. Gareth was the official manager of the station. He handled the paperwork, contracts, and alliances. For him, this marriage was a practical matter, almost mathematical. 2 properties united, 2 strong names, a fortune that would double. Charlotte was beautiful, educated in the city, knew how to play piano and speak French. Any man in the region would have accepted that arrangement without a second thought. But Angus wasn't just any man, and he carried a wound inside that still smarted. 2 years prior, Angus had been engaged to a young woman named Amelia, daughter of station owners from a distant district. The wedding was already set, invitations sent, and the entire region expected the party to be the biggest of the year. Until one night, weeks before the ceremony, Angus arrived earlier than expected at his future in-law's home. He entered through the back door, as he did with the familiarity of a nearly son-in-law, and heard Amelia's voice in the corridor. She was talking to her older sister, and what she said made Angus feel the ground disappear beneath his feet. Amelia called him a rough, unrefined bushman. She said she'd only tolerate the marriage until she could transfer part of the lands into her name, and that afterwards, she'd find ways to live the life she truly desired, far from that man with rough, calloused hands that smelled of damp earth. Angus didn't say a word that night. He left as silently as he'd entered. He mounted his horse and rode until dawn. The next day, he publicly broke off the engagement, without detailed explanations, and the scandal spread through the entire region like wildfire through dry bush. Amelia and her family spread rumors that Angus was unstable, suspicious, incapable of keeping a woman. And he let them talk, because the pain of betrayal was so great he had no breath left to defend himself. Since then, Angus had closed his heart with the same firmness with which he locked the gates of his property. He came to believe that no woman would ever truly see him, that all would only see the station, the cattle, the bags of coffee, the thousands of acres of fertile land his name represented. It was in this state of mind that Gareth appeared with Charlotte's proposal. Angus refused, once, twice, thrice. On the 4th time, Gareth lost his patience and said his brother would die alone, bitter, surrounded by cattle, with no one to carry on the family name. Angus listened in silence, but the words echoed in his head for days, and it was then, on a sleepless dawn, that the idea was born. He wouldn't accept Charlotte, he wouldn't accept any arranged marriage, but he would do something no one expected. He'd go down to the workers' quarters, dress like a station hand, use a false name, and live among the ordinary folk working on his own land. If there was a woman capable of liking a man who had nothing, he'd find her there, in the dust of the fields, far from ballrooms and fancy dresses. Gareth thought his brother had lost his marbles. He called it madness, an unnecessary humiliation, saying he just needed to pick a bride from a list of decent families and get on with it. But when he saw Angus wouldn't change his mind, he agreed to keep it a secret. He would handle the management, and if anyone asked, he'd say Angus had gone to resolve business in another state. The only other person who knew was Gertrude, the homestead cook, who had practically raised the two brothers after their mother died of fever when they were boys. Gertrude cried, prayed, called Angus stubborn, but in the end, she did exactly what he asked. She sorted out the oldest clothes she could find in the store shed, prepared a swag bag with a few things, and blessed the young man at the back door of the homestead one Friday afternoon. Angus walked down the dirt track that linked the homestead to the workers' dwellings. He carried only his swag bag on his back, and in his pocket, a letter of introduction Gareth had written in disguised handwriting, recommending a certain Manny for laboring work on the market garden. When he reached the hands area, the sun was already dipping, painting the sky a deep orange that bled across the tomato plants, the crooked fences, and the whitewashed little hut where the workers ate their meals and spent the week. Angus knew that place from afar, from the homestead window, like someone knows a drawing on a map, but to be there up close, to smell the turned earth mixed with sweat and reheated coffee, was a completely different experience. Desmond sat on a wooden bench beside the store shed when he saw the stranger approach. He sized him up from top to bottom with that look people give when they're weighing up what you're worth. He read the letter of recommendation without much interest and pointed to a row of hoes leaning against the wall. "Tomorrow, you start at 4 a.m. in the tomato patch," he said with the dry voice of someone who's repeated the same phrase for years. "Sleep in the men's bunkhouse, eat what's in the mess hall, and don't cause any trouble." Angus nodded in silence, without lifting his eyes, playing the role of a humble man who needed that job to survive. But inside, his eyes were wide open, registering every detail of that place that was his by right, and that he realized at that moment he knew far less about than he'd imagined. That first night, lying on a canvas stretcher bed strung between two wooden posts, Angus listened to the other workers talk in low voices before sleeping. They spoke of Desmond with a mix of anger and resignation. They grumbled about the tucker that got worse each week. They commented that blankets were short in the store shed, even though the boss ordered new ones every month. And among the murmurs, one name appeared more than once, always accompanied by cruel laughter or heavy silences. Eleanor, the drover's daughter, the one who'd arrived recently. They said she carried a thief's blood in her veins, that she'd brought bad luck to the station. Ever since she'd set foot there, Desmond only kept her because he couldn't find anyone willing to work as cheaply and as hard as she did. Angus listened in silence and stored that name in his memory, not yet knowing it would change everything. The first day of work began before the sun. Angus was woken by the sound of a tin can banging against a wooden post, which was Desmond's way of getting the hands out of bed. Darkness still held the yard when the workers filed out towards the market garden, carrying hoes, buckets, and wicker baskets. Angus went with them, feeling on his shoulders the weight of a life he'd never truly experienced. He'd always known his workers woke early, always known the work was tough, but knowing is one thing, and feeling is another entirely. When the sun rose and began to warm the red earth between the tomato rows, Angus's hands were already burning and his back aching. It was mid-morning when he first saw her. She was crouched between two rows, sorting ripe tomatoes from green ones with a speed that showed practice and attention. She must have been about 25. She wore a simple dress of coarse fabric, faded by the sun and countless washes, and a headscarf tied to protect her from the heat. Her skin was sun-baked from living outdoors, her arms thin but firm, like someone who knew hard work. And when she lifted her face for a moment to wipe the sweat from her brow, Angus saw brown eyes that carried an ancient sadness and a silent dignity that hit him like a punch to the gut. It was Eleanor. He knew without anyone needing to say, because around her there was an empty space. The other workers deliberately left, as if loneliness were an invisible fence everyone respected, except her. Desmond rode through the market garden mid-morning, inspecting the work. When he reached the row where Eleanor was working, he stopped his horse and watched her for a moment that was too long to be just supervision. Then he spoke loudly for all to hear that the tomatoes in her section were poorly sorted, that there was a mix of ripe and green ones in the baskets, and that he'd deduct it from her rations that week. Eleanor didn't lift her head, didn't say a word. She continued working with the same precise and careful movements, while the overseer rode away laughing. Angus, a few meters away, felt the blood rush to his face. He looked at Eleanor's baskets and saw that the sorting was perfect, impeccable, better than any other worker in that row. Desmond had lied in front of everyone, and no one said a thing. The midday sun was relentless. Angus, unaccustomed to that level of continuous physical effort, felt his vision blur and his legs wobble. He leaned on his hoe, trying to catch his breath, but the heat was a solid wall pushing him to the ground. The other workers passed him without stopping, some casting indifferent glances, others pretending not to see. No one offered help. And then a hand appeared in front of his eyes, holding a tin mug full of water. Angus lifted his head and found Eleanor standing beside him, offering the mug, with an expression that wasn't pity or obligation, but something he had unlearned to recognize. It was simply kindness. He accepted the water, drank slowly while she waited, and when he returned the mug, their eyes met for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. She nodded her head, put the mug in her apron pocket, and went back to work without a word. And Angus stood there with the taste of that simple water in his mouth and a strange feeling in his chest, as if something that had been dormant for a long time had just opened its eyes. What Angus didn't yet know was that Eleanor carried a secret about her past directly connected to that station. And what Eleanor couldn't imagine was that the man to whom she had just offered water was the owner of every inch of ground she walked on. But fate, when it decides to cross two paths, doesn't warn or ask permission. The weeks that followed changed Angus in ways he never would have predicted. The manual labor punished his body in a new and humbling way for a man used to giving orders from the height of a desk. His hands, which once held fine leather reins and quill pens, were now covered in calluses and cuts that stung every time he grabbed a hoe. He woke before the sun with aches in his shoulders and back. He ate the same scrappy tucker the other hands received, a thin bean stew with flour, and sometimes a piece of jerky so tough it felt like saddle leather. He slept on a canvas cot, listening to the snores and coughs of his bunkmates, and each night he wondered how those people endured it their whole lives without going mad. But what bothered Angus most wasn't the tiredness or the food. It was realizing how blind he had been to what was happening on his own lands. Desmond managed the station as if it were a small private kingdom. Angus gradually realized this in the details that only someone living among the workers could notice. The meat that was supposed to arrive every week at the mess hall appeared only every fortnight, and always in smaller quantities than Angus knew he authorized in the purchase orders. The new blankets he ordered every winter never reached the cots, and the workers slept with old, patched-up rags. The tools were old and poorly maintained, even though Angus had approved funds for their replacement at the beginning of that very year. Each discovery was like a burning ember in the disguised station owner's chest, but he forced himself to swallow his anger and commit everything to memory, because he knew he needed proof, not just suspicions, to bring down a man who had been in charge of that place for over a decade. Eleanor remained Desmond's favorite target. Not a day passed without the overseer finding some reason to humiliate her in front of the others. If it rained and the tomatoes got waterlogged on the vine, it was Eleanor's fault for not covering the rows in time. If the sun was too hot and the leaves withered, it was Eleanor who had watered too little. If a basket returned from the field with one cracked fruit among 50 perfect ones, Desmond would raise that fruit in the air and yell her name for everyone to hear. Angus began to understand that this persecution wasn't just gratuitous cruelty, there was something calculated about it, as if Desmond needed to keep Eleanor always down, always cornered, always owing something she could never repay. And the other workers, out of fear or habit, followed the overseer's example. No one sat beside Eleanor in the mess hall. No one asked her for help or offered company. It was as if she lived inside a bubble of silence that everyone respected, except herself. The exception was Stan, an old worker with white hair and big hands, who was already over 70 and had lived on the station since Angus's father's time. Stan was naturally quiet, one of those men who speak little and observe much, but he had a subtle and constant way of protecting Eleanor. He'd save a spot for her on the mess hall bench, even if he later got up to leave. He'd leave his tin mug of water near hers, without saying anything when the sun was scorching. And on nights when Desmond forced Eleanor to work overtime as an invented punishment, Stan would sit in the yard, smoking his pipe until she finished, like a silent sentinel who needed no words to say he was there. Angus noticed this discreet protection and came to respect the old man even before exchanging a word with him. It was Stan, in fact, who unwittingly planted the first seed of curiosity that would link Eleanor's past to Angus's destiny. One night when the two were sitting in the yard after dinner, while the other hands had already retired, the old man commented in a low voice that Eleanor was Tobias's daughter, the drover. Angus felt a snap in his memory upon hearing that name, like someone recognizing an old melody without remembering where they'd heard it. Tobias, the drover. He knew that name from somewhere, from some conversation, from some document that had passed through his hands. But the memory didn't come complete that night. It circled his head like a stubborn mosquito that wouldn't be shooed away. Stan said nothing more on the subject, just puffed his pipe and looked at the starry sky. And Angus stored that name in the back of his mind, like someone guarding a key, not yet knowing which door it opened. What Angus did know, because he'd heard it from the other workers in the first few days, was the version everyone repeated. Tobias had been accused of stealing heads of cattle from a powerful station owner in the region. He was arrested, tried, clear his throat, without a decent defense, and died in jail before any appeal could save him. Eleanor's mother wasted away from grief and died months later, leaving her daughter alone in the world with a tarnished name that weighed like iron on her shoulders. Eleanor wandered from station to station for almost 2 years, being dismissed whenever someone discovered whose daughter she was. Until Desmond accepted her at Arroera Downs for such a miserable payment, it was almost working for free. The hands said Desmond only kept her because he liked having someone to walk all over, and that Eleanor put up with it because she had nowhere else to go in the world. Angus slowly approached Eleanor, with the care of someone approaching a wounded animal that has learned to distrust any outstretched hand. In the first few days, she barely looked at him, answered his attempts at conversation with one-word answers, and avoided his gaze as if afraid any closeness could be used against her later. But Angus didn't give up. He started with small gestures, the same ones she had made for him that first day. When he saw her carrying overly heavy baskets, he would appear beside her and take one without asking permission. When Desmond yelled at her in front of everyone, Angus was the only one who didn't laugh and didn't drop his head. He'd stand still, looking steadily at the overseer, and even without saying anything, that silent presence was a kind of protest that Eleanor began to notice. The first real conversation between the two happened by the creek that ran at the back of the property, where the workers washed clothes on Sundays. Eleanor was alone, scrubbing a sheet against the smooth stones. When Angus appeared, bringing his own clothes to wash, he sat down at a respectful distance and began to work in silence. They stayed like that for a long time, just the two of them and the sound of the water, until Eleanor asked where he was from. Angus told a carefully edited version of the truth. He said he was from another region, that he had lost the family lands due to a botched business deal, and that he was starting over from scratch. Eleanor listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she simply said she knew what it was like to lose everything and still have to keep going. There was no pity in her voice, no excessive curiosity. There was a simple recognition between two people who knew pain up close and didn't need to explain too much to understand each other. From that Sunday on, their meetings at the creek became a silent habit. Every week, without arranging it, they would both appear there at the same time and wash clothes side by side, talking slowly about small things that gradually revealed big things. Eleanor told him about her father, how he was the best drover in that region, an honorable man who knew every track and shortcut in the bush, and who treated animals with more kindness than many men treated their families. She said her father had never stolen anything in his life, that the accusation was a lie from beginning to end, and that she knew it with the certainty of someone who knows a person's character, not by what people say, but by what she saw with her own eyes for years. Her voice didn't tremble with anger when she spoke of it. It trembled with a sadness so ancient and so deep that it seemed to have taken root inside her. Angus listened to every word with doubled attention, and the more he listened, the more that name, Tobias the drover, pricked at his memory like a splinter under the skin. One night, after another exhausting day in the fields, Angus lay awake on his cot while everyone slept, sifting through his own memories. And then it came, not like a lightning bolt, but like a slow tide finally reaching the shore. Tobias. There was a document in Gareth's office, an old cattle transport contract, signed by a station owner named Edward Thompson. The same Edward who now wanted his daughter Charlotte to marry Angus. The same Edward whose station bordered Arroera Downs. Angus couldn't recall the details of that contract, but he knew Tobias's name was on it, and he knew Desmond also had a connection to Edward, because that's who the overseer worked for before coming to Angus's father. The coincidence was too great to be just a coincidence, but Angus didn't have all the pieces yet, only the corners of a jigsaw puzzle, that disturbed him more and more. While the disguised station owner gathered clues, unaware he was assembling something bigger than he imagined, the feeling between him and Eleanor grew in that gentle, inevitable way true things do. There were no declarations or grand gestures. There was her hand straightening the collar of his shirt when it turned inside out during washing at the creek. There was his way of always keeping the best fruit from his basket to leave on the edge of the row where she worked. There were the glances that lasted a second longer than necessary and spoke things neither of them dared to put into words. There was, above all, the slow and precious discovery that there was someone in the world who understood them without needing explanation. Someone who saw beyond the worn-out clothes and the tarnished name and found something worthwhile beneath it all. One afternoon, Angus saw Eleanor leave the fields early and head towards the paddock where the horses grazed. He followed her from a distance and found her kneeling beside an old mare that the other workers had abandoned in a corner of the fence because she was sick and limping on a hind leg. Eleanor was cleaning the animal's hoof with a damp cloth, talking softly to the mare as if she were a friend. She had prepared an herbal mixture that she applied to the wound with care and patience, and the animal, which shied away from anyone else, remained still under her hands, as if it knew it was safe there. Angus stood behind a tree, watching the scene, and felt something break inside his chest, not from sadness, but from pure admiration. That woman who had nothing in the world spent the little free time she had caring for an animal no one else wanted. She didn't do it to be seen, didn't do it for reward. She did it because that's who she was. And in that moment, Angus knew with a clarity that startled him that he wasn't just curious or interested anymore. He was starting to love Eleanor in a way he hadn't felt since before Amelia destroyed his ability to trust. But that nascent feeling carried a terrible weight. Angus knew he was lying to Eleanor every day. Every time she called him Manny, every time he let her believe he was just another aimless station hand, he was building that bond on a false foundation. And the question that kept him awake was always the same. When she discovered the truth, would Eleanor forgive him? Or would she see him as just another powerful man, playing with other people's lives? Another person who had deceived her, another betrayal to add to the ones she already carried. The fear of that answer was so great that Angus kept pushing the revelation forward, day after day, telling himself he would wait for the right moment, knowing deep down that the right moment might never exist. On a hot Tuesday when the air seemed to be on fire, Desmond gathered all the workers in the yard after dinner. His face was red and his small eyes gleamed in that way the hands already knew and feared. He announced that 4 heads of cattle had disappeared from the north paddock, that someone was stealing from the station, and that he would find out who it was, even if he had to search every corner of the property. His eyes swept across the faces of the workers, one by one, until they stopped on Eleanor, who stood at the back of the group, alone as always. Desmond didn't directly accuse her that night, but the look he gave her said everything that needed to be said without words. The others understood the message. The next day, Eleanor's isolation worsened. No one spoke to her, no one came near, and some murmured loudly enough for her to hear that a thief's daughter doesn't fall far from the tree. Angus watched it all with a cold fury that grew by the hour. He knew Eleanor hadn't stolen anything. He knew, from the logic of the books not adding up and the disappearing supplies, that the real thief was Desmond. But proving it required more than intuition. He needed numbers, records, something concrete he could put on the table when the time came. And that time, Angus felt it in his bones, was approaching faster than he had planned, because that same night, after everyone had retired, Angus saw through the gap in the bunkhouse something that made his blood run cold. Desmond emerged from the store shed carrying a heavy bag on his back, looked around cautiously, and walked towards the back fence, where a man on horseback waited in the darkness. There was a quick exchange, the bag for something Desmond pocketed, and the horseman disappeared into the night. Angus etched every detail of it into his memory and returned to his cot with his heart hammering. He had seen it with his own eyes. But what Desmond did next would make everything much more urgent and much more dangerous. That week, Desmond would drop his overseer's mask and show a face Eleanor never expected to confront alone. And Angus would have to choose between maintaining his disguise or revealing who he really was, to protect the woman who, unknowingly, had given him back the will to live. 3 days passed after Angus saw Desmond make his mysterious trade in the darkness. 3 days during which the disguised station owner worked in the fields with his senses on high alert, observing every move the overseer made, every trip to the store shed, every whispered conversation Desmond had with his trusted foreman. And the more he observed, the more he understood that the theft scheme wasn't recent or small. Desmond had been systematically pilfering tools, blankets, bags of coffee, and even heads of cattle for months, maybe years, selling everything on the side and pocketing the profit while the workers went hungry and cold with what was left. The man had set up an entire black market on Angus's back, using the distance between the homestead and the workers' quarters as a shield, knowing the boss rarely came down to see firsthand what was happening at the base of his own property. But Desmond was clever. He didn't steal all at once. He didn't leave obvious tracks, and whenever a shortage appeared in the accounts, he always had someone to blame. Lately, that someone was Eleanor. Angus realized that the persecution against her wasn't just a cruel temperament, it was strategy. Desmond needed a permanent scapegoat, someone everyone already distrusted because of her father's story, someone without friends and without a voice to defend herself. Eleanor was perfect for this role, and the overseer used her with the coldness of someone moving pieces on a chessboard. Every public humiliation, every invented accusation, every punishment inflicted served to reinforce in the minds of the other workers the idea that if something went missing on the station, the culprit could only be the thieving drover's daughter. And the worst part was, it worked. That clears throat. Wednesday, Angus was weeding a row when he saw Stan approach, with slow steps and his pipe unlit between his teeth. A sign that he wanted to talk and not just smoke. The old man squatted beside him, pretending to examine the roots of a tomato plant, and spoke without looking at Angus, keeping his voice to a whisper barely audible over the wind. He said Eleanor was in real danger, that Desmond was no longer just humiliating her to keep up appearances, that the overseer had other interests in her, interests that had nothing to do with work and were becoming more evident each week. Stan had old eyes, but they were eyes that saw far. And what they'd seen on recent nights was Desmond prowling around the women's bunkhouse after everyone slept, testing doors, peeking through gaps, waiting for the moment. Eleanor was vulnerable enough not to have the strength to resist. Angus felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. He thanked Stan with a discreet nod and spent the rest of that day with his jaw clenched with rage and his mind working at double speed. The situation had changed. It was no longer just a matter of gathering evidence against a corrupt overseer. It was a matter of protecting Eleanor from something much worse, and time was running out. Angus thought about revealing everything right then and there, ripping off his station hand's shirt, yelling his real name, and booting Desmond right off the property, but he knew a hasty revelation could make the overseer flee before being held accountable, and worse, it could forever destroy the trust Eleanor was beginning to place in him. She trusted Manny, the hand who washed clothes beside her at the creek. If she discovered Manny was Angus, the station owner who kept her in miserable conditions while Desmond stole, she might never look at him the same way again. That night, Angus didn't sleep in the men's bunkhouse. He dragged his cot outside, leaned against the external wooden wall, and kept an eye on the yard, watching for any movement towards the women's bunkhouse. The night passed slowly and silently, with only the crickets and the distant bark of a dog breaking the darkness. Desmond didn't appear. But the next day, and the day after that, Angus repeated the vigil, sleeping in short snatches, always with one ear open and his eyes fixed on the shadows. The exhaustion piled up on top of the exhaustion that already existed, and in the fields, his movements became slower, heavier, his body paying the price for those sleepless nights. Eleanor noticed. She was observant by survival instinct, and Angus's sunken eyes and trembling hands didn't escape her attention. The following Sunday, at the creek, while they washed clothes side by side, she stopped scrubbing and looked at him with a frankness that caught him off guard. She said he looked unwell, that he was thinner and paler each day, and that if he was going through any trouble, he could tell her, even if she couldn't do much. Eleanor's voice was low and firm, without melodrama, without insistence, just the sincere offer of someone who knew the weight of carrying problems alone and didn't wish that on anyone. Angus felt a lump in his throat so tight that for an instant he couldn't reply. He looked at that woman whom the whole world treated as dirt, and who still found within herself the generosity to worry about another, and he knew he didn't deserve that kindness. Not while he was lying to her. He wanted to tell her everything right there and then, with his feet in the cold water and the Sunday sun filtering through the willow leaves. He opened his mouth to begin, but before the first word came out, a sound of branches snapping on the track made them both turn their heads at the same time. It was one of the workers, a woman named Fiona, running and breathless down to the creek bank. She said Desmond was calling everyone to the yard immediately, that something serious had happened, and that anyone who didn't appear in 5 minutes would be dismissed on the spot. Eleanor and Angus looked at each other, dropped their clothes on the stones, and hurried up the track. When they reached the yard, The workers were already gathered in a semicircle in front of the store shed. Desmond stood in the center, his face red like someone who'd been drinking or who was staging calculated anger. And beside him were 3 open and torn bags of coffee beans, spilling across the dirt floor. The overseer waited for everyone to be present, swept his eyes over the group with that theatrical slowness he used to intimidate, and then pointed his finger directly at Eleanor. His voice was loud and gruff, designed to humiliate. He said he had found the bags hidden behind the women's bunkhouse, that someone was diverting coffee from the station to sell in the township, and that the evidence pointed to one person. He looked at Eleanor with a smile that was more like a threat, and said he had already sent word to the station owner, that the boss would surely send for the police, and that the thieving drover's daughter would end up in the same place as her old man. The silence that fell over the yard was so thick that Angus could feel its weight on his shoulders. No one spoke, no one moved. The workers looked at the ground, to the sides, anywhere but Eleanor's face, because looking at her meant taking sides, and taking sides against Desmond meant losing their job, their roof, and their food. Eleanor stood in the middle of that cowardly silence, her hands wet from the creek hanging by her sides, and her eyes wide with a disbelief that was slowly morphing into something worse. It wasn't fear. It was the bitter recognition of someone who had been through this before and knew that the truth didn't matter when everyone had already decided who was to blame. Angus stepped forward. His body moved before his mind could stop it, pushed by an indignation that no longer fit inside him. He spoke loudly and firmly, not with Manny's humble voice, and said that Eleanor hadn't stolen anything. He said he had been watching the women's bunkhouse for the past few nights, and had never seen Eleanor leave or hide anything. And he said, looking Desmond squarely in the eyes, that perhaps the overseer should explain why he left the store shed in the middle of the night, carrying heavy bags to hand over to a horseman waiting by the back fence. The entire yard held its breath. Desmond staggered for an instant before regaining his composure and contorting his face into a mask of fury. He lunged towards Angus, finger-pointing, calling him a liar, a vagabond, an accomplice of the thief. He said Manny was as guilty as Eleanor, and that both would be expelled that very night. He grabbed Angus by the collar of his shirt and pushed him hard, making him stumble backward and fall onto the spilled coffee bags. Eleanor cried out and tried to get between the two, but Desmond grabbed her arm with a violence that made her whimper in pain. He pulled her close, so close she could smell stale, cheap whiskey on his breath, and snarled that if she didn't keep quiet, what would come next would be much worse than a simple accusation of theft. Angus rose from the ground with a calm that contrasted with the blood trickling from a cut on his eyebrow where he had hit the corner of a crate. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and looked at Desmond with eyes that were no longer those of Manny, the aimless station hand. They were the eyes of a man who had made a decision and would not go back on it. He looked at Eleanor, who stared at him with despair and confusion, and then he looked at the gathered workers, those people who lived on his lands, ate what he produced, and slept under his roof without ever having seen his true face. He took a deep breath and knew the moment had come, not as he had planned, not in the setting he would have chosen, but life rarely respects the plans of those who live it. He unbuttoned the first button of his worn-out shirt and pulled from within it a leather cord he had kept hidden since the day he arrived at the station. From the cord hung a heavy gold signet ring with the initials AN etched into it, the signet ring that belonged to the owner of Arrowera Downs Station and was registered at the registry office as proof of identity and authority over that property. He held the ring high, where the fading evening light could reflect on the gold. And for the first time since he had set foot in that yard weeks ago, he spoke with the voice that was truly his, not Manny's soft voice, but the deep, firm voice of someone born to give orders, and who had learned to do so with justice. He said his full name. He said he was the owner of that land, those horses, that coffee spilled on the ground, that store shed Desmond had been plundering for months. He said he had lived among them as a worker to see with his own eyes what the walls of the homestead had prevented him from seeing. And he said, turning to Desmond with a contained rage that made his voice tremble, that the overseer was stripped of his position right then and there, and would answer for every bag of coffee diverted, for every head of cattle secretly sold, for every blanket stolen from the workers, for every humiliation inflicted on those who couldn't defend themselves. Desmond staggered backward as if he'd been shot. The color drained from his face and returned in irregular red blotches that revealed the panic of someone watching their castle of lies crumble all at once. He tried to speak, stammered something about not knowing, about confusion, about a mistake, but the words tumbled out over each other like drunks on a narrow footpath. The workers around them stirred, murmurs running through them like waves, faces turning to Angus with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and, gradually, recognition. Stan, from the back of the group, took his pipe from his mouth and nodded slowly, as if to say he'd always known, or at least always suspected, but Angus's eyes weren't on the workers, nor on Desmond. They were on Eleanor, and what he saw there hit him deeper than any punch or fall ever could. Eleanor looked at him with an expression that was several things at once. Surprise, yes. Confusion, certainly. But there was something more, something Angus feared he would find, and that he now saw etched in those brown eyes with the clarity of a sentence. Disappointment. The same disappointment of someone who discovers the only person they trusted also had a hidden face behind the one they showed. Eleanor didn't say a word. She freed herself from Desmond's grip, which no longer had the strength to hold her, and walked away from the yard with steps that were firm on the outside and shattered within. Angus wanted to go after her, but Desmond seized the instant of hesitation to try and flee, and the ensuing chaos prevented anything but dealing with the immediate disaster. Stan and two younger workers held Desmond before he reached the fence. The overseer struggled, swore, threatened reprisals he no longer had the power to carry out, and was tied to a post in the yard until someone could go to the township to fetch the authorities. Angus sent one of the hands to run to the homestead to call Gareth, who arrived less than an hour later, on horseback, eyes wide and mouth agape, seeing his brother covered in dust and blood in the middle of the workers' yard. Angus explained everything in a few harsh sentences, and Gareth, being a practical man above all else, took control of the situation. He ordered a stocktake of the store shed, separated Desmond's records, summoned witnesses among the hands, and prepared a formal complaint to be taken to the city the next morning. While Gareth organized the chaos, Angus looked for Eleanor. She wasn't in the women's bunkhouse, not at the creek, not in the fields, nor in the stables. Angus searched every corner of the property he knew, and many he only discovered that night, calling her name in a voice that no longer tried to disguise his desperation. It was Stan who found him walking in circles near the back fence and said, with the calm of someone who has lived long enough to know that some things aren't solved by rushing, that Eleanor had probably gone to the only place on that station where she felt at peace, the old jacaranda tree, high on the East Hill, where she went alone when the pain became too great to fit inside the bunkhouse. Angus climbed the hill in the dark, guided only by the moon and instinct, and there at the top, sitting among the exposed roots of the enormous jacaranda, her face bathed in tears and her arms wrapped around her knees, was Eleanor. She heard him approach and didn't turn around. Angus stopped a few steps away, not daring to come closer, and the silence between them was so different from the silences they had shared by the creek that it hurt like a burn. Here there was no comfort. Here there was a distance made of hidden truths that now separated two people who, just hours before, were learning to trust each other. Eleanor had lost many things in her life, her father, her mother, her good name, her dignity, but she had never lost faith in someone she chose to love until that moment. And now Angus would have to find the right words to prove that the man she had met in the fields and the man who had hidden the truth from her were, deep down, the same person, or lose her forever, not to another man, but to the fear of trusting again. Angus stood there a few steps from Eleanor, with the moon pouring a cold light over them, and the old jacaranda serving as a mute witness to what was to come. He didn't know where to start. He had rehearsed speeches in his head for weeks, pretty phrases about noble intentions, and how the disguise was necessary to find the truth. But now, before her, all those words seemed too small for the magnitude of the damage. Eleanor didn't look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on her own hands, those calloused hands that had shared water with him, cared for a sick mare, and washed clothes beside him on sunny Sundays. Angus took a deep breath and did the only thing left for him. He sat down on the earth right there, without coming closer, without trying to touch her, and began to speak not as a station owner, not as a boss, but as the man she had met in the fields. He told her everything from the beginning. He told her about Amelia, about the broken engagement, about the words he heard in that corridor that poisoned his ability to believe in anyone. He told her about Gareth's pressure, about Charlotte, about the fear of spending the rest of his life surrounded by people who only saw his lands and his cattle. He told her the idea of the disguise was born of desperation, not amusement, that there was nothing amusing about waking before the sun to hoe rows with raw hands, and he said, his voice breaking for the first time, that at no point in the original plan was there a possibility of finding someone like her. He said he had gone down to those fields looking for an answer to a simple question, and that Eleanor, unknowingly, unintentionally, without asking for anything in return, had answered with every small gesture she had made since the day she handed him a tin mug of water in the scorching heat. Eleanor listened in silence. She didn't interrupt, didn't look at him, didn't move her body. When Angus finished speaking, silence settled between them again, like a third, heavy, living presence. Minutes passed that seemed to carry the weight of entire hours. Then, Eleanor spoke, and her voice came out hoarse and low, scraping in her throat like someone swallowing thorns. She said the pain she felt wasn't because he was rich, or because he owned the station. The pain was because he had chosen to lie. She said that all her life people had lied about her father, about who she was and what she deserved, and that Manny had been the first person in a long time who seemed incapable of lying. And discovering that Manny was the biggest lie of all hurt more than any of Desmond's curses, more than the contempt of the other workers, more than sleeping hungry on a cold night. Angus felt every word like a thin blade slipping between his ribs. He didn't defend himself, didn't justify himself, because he knew she was right. He said, with an honesty that was the only thing he could still offer, that if he could go back, he would have told her the truth, that first Sunday by the creek, that the fear of losing her was greater than the courage to be honest, and that this was his failing, not hers, that she had every right to leave, to never want to see him again, and that if that was her decision, he would respect it and ensure she had somewhere to go and how to live with dignity, without depending on anyone. He stood up slowly, took the signet ring from the cord, and placed it on the ground between them, on the dark earth of the hill. He said that ring was proof of who he was on the outside, but that everything she needed to know about who he was on the inside, she already knew. And then he turned and began to descend the hill, because he understood that staying there would be to pressure her, and Eleanor had already received too much pressure from men who wanted to decide for her. He descended the entire hill without looking back, though each step cost an effort that had nothing to do with his body. When he reached the yard, Gareth was waiting for him with news. Desmond had been taken to the township under escort by 2 trusted hands, and would remain imprisoned until trial. The stocktake of the store shed confirmed huge discrepancies, much greater than Angus had estimated, and among the papers found in the overseer's room were letters, receipts, and notes that revealed the full extent of the scheme. Gareth extended a bundle of yellow documents and said Angus needed to read them carefully, because what was inside changed a lot of things. Angus took the papers to the whitewashed workers' hut, sat at the rough wooden table where the hands had their meals, and began to read by the light of an oil lamp. And as he read, his face changed expression, like a sky changing from cloudy to stormy. Among Desmond's documents was a letter signed by Edward Thompson, the neighboring station owner, Charlotte's father. The letter was almost 3 years old, and in it, Edward instructed Desmond to forge evidence against a drover named Tobias, who had discovered that Edward was using his transport routes to smuggle stolen cattle from smaller stations in the region. Tobias threatened to report everything to the authorities. Edward's solution was simple and monstrous: by the testimony of 2 witnesses, bribe a constable, and turn the whistleblower into the accused. Tobias was arrested as a cattle thief, when in fact he was the only honest person in that whole chain of crimes. And Desmond, who before working at Aroera Down Station was Edward's henchman, was the man who executed the plan, planted the evidence, and ensured the drover never left jail to tell his side of the story. Angus dropped the papers on the table and stared at the wall for a time he couldn't measure. Eleanor's father was innocent, always had been, and the man who destroyed him was the same man who now wanted his daughter to marry Angus to unite their stations. The same hand that signed Tobias's conviction now extended a marriage contract disguised as a business alliance. Angus felt such deep disgust he had to leave the hut and breathe the night air to keep from throwing up. And along with the disgust came a determination clear as spring water. He would clear Tobias's name, take those documents to the proper authorities, and make Edward answer for every day Tobias spent in jail, for every tear Eleanor's mother shed until she died of grief, for every humiliation Eleanor endured, carrying a name that should never have been tarnished. The night wore on, and Angus couldn't sleep. He sat in the yard, rereading the documents, jotting down names and dates, preparing in his head what he would need to do in the coming days. As the sky began to lighten on the edges of the horizon, painting the clouds a pale pink, heralding the dawn, he heard footsteps on the dirt behind him. He turned and found Eleanor standing a few meters away, her dress creased like someone who also hadn't slept, her eyes swollen and red, and in her right hand, hanging by the leather cord, the signet ring he had left on the hill. She said nothing for a long moment, just stood there looking at him with those brown eyes that carried weariness, pain, and something more that Angus dared not name for fear of seeing what he wanted to see and not what truly existed. Eleanor sat beside him on the wooden bench, placed the ring between them, just as he had done on the hill, and spoke, looking forward to the rising horizon. She said she had spent the entire night thinking, replaying every moment since the day Manny appeared on the station. Every conversation by the creek, every gesture in the fields, every glance that lasted a second longer. And she said that, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find a lie in those moments. The man who shared water with her, who carried her baskets, who confronted Desmond in the yard, who stayed awake night after night guarding the women's bunkhouse without her knowing, that man was real. The name was false, the clothes were a disguise, but the hands that helped and the eyes that saw when no one else saw, those were true. And it was in that she chose to believe, because if she let the fear of being deceived destroy the only good thing life had put in her path, then the Desmonds and the Neds of the world would have won for good. Angus listened to every word without breathing. When Eleanor finished, he slowly extended his hand, palm up, open, not imposing anything, just offering. Eleanor looked at that hand for an instant that contained within it their whole story. The tin mug of water, the clothes washed by the creek, the shared silence, the revealed pain, the discovered lie, the forgiveness that cost more than any station debt. And then she placed her hand over his. It wasn't a grand gesture, it was a small and immense gesture at the same time, as all true things tend to be. They sat there side by side, hand in hand, watching the sun rise over a land that belonged to him by right of inheritance. But that morning seemed to belong to them both by right of choice. In the following weeks, Angus kept every promise he made to himself that night. He took Desmond's documents to the state capital, accompanied by Gareth and a trusted lawyer the family kept for serious matters. Tobias's case was reopened. The false witnesses, confronted with Edward's letters, confessed to the bribe. The constable who had handled the arrest was suspended and investigated, and Edward Thompson, the powerful station owner who destroyed an innocent man to protect his crimes, was arrested on his own station one Tuesday morning in front of his daughter Charlotte, who watched from a distance, her face white and her lips pressed tight, not understanding how the world her father had built could crumble so quickly. Tobias's name was officially cleared by a judicial decision that recognized the fraudulent evidence and the drover's innocence. Angus had the judgment published in the regional newspapers and posted it on the door of the nearest township church, so that all who had repeated the slander could read the truth with their own eyes. When Eleanor saw the document with her father's name, followed by the word innocent, her legs buckled, and Angus caught her before she fell. She cried, leaning against his chest for a time. Neither of them counted, and Angus just stood there holding her, without saying anything, because there are moments when words hinder more than help, and silence is the only language that can convey the depth of emotion. Angus changed Aroera Downs station from top to bottom. He replaced Desmond with a new overseer recommended by Stan, a fair man who knew the work and respected the workers. He renovated the bunkhouses, swapped the canvas cots for proper beds, improved the tucker in the mess hall, and established clear rules about working hours and rest. He increased wages and created a system where part of the harvest was shared among the hands as a bonus. The workers who had treated Eleanor with contempt now dropped their eyes when they crossed paths with her, not out of fear, but from the silent shame of those who knew they had been cowardly when they should have been decent. Eleanor demanded nothing from any of them. She didn't rub it in their faces, didn't demand apologies, didn't change her ways. She continued to be who she always was, and perhaps that was the harshest punishment for those who had despised her, to realize that the woman they treated as inferior was, in truth, the best person in that place. The marriage proposal didn't come in a rose garden or a chandelier-lit ballroom. It came by the creek, on a sunny Sunday, with the two of them sitting on the same stones where they had washed clothes together weeks ago. Angus didn't kneel. He didn't make long speeches, didn't prepare surprises. He looked at Eleanor and said he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her, not because he needed a wife to carry on a name, but because he had found in her the person with whom he wanted to share his Sundays and Mondays, the good days and the bad, breakfast and the silence of the night. He said he didn't offer perfection, because he had already proven himself capable of making terrible mistakes. But he offered honesty from then on. No disguises, no false names, nothing between them that wasn't truth. Eleanor looked at the water flowing between the stones and smiled. And that smile was so different from the small, sad smiles Angus had seen in the first few days that it seemed to belong to another person. It was an open, full smile, from someone who finally allowed herself to feel joy without fear of it being snatched away the next minute. She said she accepted not for the signet ring, nor the station, nor the homestead she had never even visited, but for the man who carried her baskets up the hill and stayed awake night after night to ensure she was safe, even when she didn't know and didn't ask. She said she accepted Manny and Angus because she had learned that the two were the same man, just seen from different angles. They married in a simple ceremony at the township chapel, with Gareth as best man, Gertrude crying in the front row, and Stan smoking his pipe outside because he said the church made him sneeze. The station workers all came, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to be there. And the line of men and women in clean clothes and scrubbed faces, stretching out the chapel door, was proof that something had changed on that land, in a way that went far beyond a wedding. Eleanor wore a simple white dress that Gertrude had hand-sewn for 3 weeks, embroidering small flowers on the collar with the same dedication with which she seasoned the homestead stew. And when the priest asked if Eleanor accepted Angus as her husband, she replied with a clear, firm voice that echoed off the stone walls of the chapel and made more than one person in the pews discreetly wipe their eyes. The months that followed were a period of slow and patient building, like everything made to last. Eleanor moved up to the homestead and learned to manage the property alongside Angus and Gareth, bringing a perspective the two brothers had never had. The perspective of someone who knows life from the bottom up, who knows what it means to carry heavy baskets and sleep on canvas cots. Her decisions were practical and fair, and the workers trusted her in a natural way no overseer had ever achieved. Angus watched her in these moments with an admiration that grew each day, because he saw in her not just the woman he loved, but the partner he never knew he needed. One December evening, as the heat began to ease and cicadas sang in the mango trees around the homestead, Eleanor called Angus to the veranda and asked him to sit. She had something to tell him. Angus sat in the rocking chair and looked at her with that undivided attention he had learned to give since their days by the creek. Eleanor took his hand and placed it on her own belly and didn't need to say anything more. Angus understood in an instant that was like a sun rising within his chest. He pulled her close, rested his forehead against hers, and stayed there, feeling beneath his palm the promise of a new life growing inside the woman whom the whole world had despised and whom he had almost not found. Stan, who was passing through the yard at that exact moment, with his pipe and his slow, seen-it-all stride, looked at the two on the veranda and let out for the first time in years something that resembled a laugh. Then he continued on his way without saying anything, because some things speak for themselves and need no commentary. The child was born in August, on a full moon night that bathed Aroera Down Station, with a light so clear it looked like day. It was a strong, healthy boy, and Angus and Eleanor named him Tobias, because there was a name that deserved to be carried with pride once again. And when Gertrude placed the newborn in Eleanor's arms for the first time, the young woman who was once called a thief's daughter, who slept on canvas cots and ate thin bean stew and carried baskets of tomatoes under a scorching sun, looked at her son and knew that the cycle had closed. Not with vengeance, not with bitterness, but with the living proof that goodness, even when the whole world conspires against it, always finds its way back home. If this story touched your heart, I ask you to do one simple thing for me. Leave a comment and tell me what you felt hearing this story. Sometimes, a word written by a stranger is exactly what someone else on the other side of the screen needed to read that day. If you haven't subscribed to the Bush Tales channel yet, take a moment now and subscribe. Hit the bell icon to be notified every time a new story is published. And share this video with someone who needs a reminder that true love isn't impressed by appearances. It recognizes what's genuine inside each of us. Thanks for sticking with me. Your company is what makes every story worthwhile. Until next time.